And we'll start presenting. And, ooh, there we go. So we will finish this off by talking about fleas and flies. We've talked about lice. There are plenty of micropredator insects that I don't think we have time to get to, like some of the blood-sucking members of the Hemiptera, the true bugs, and then all of the parasitoids in the Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, and wasps, and things like that, and a couple of really creepy groups like the Strepsipteran twisted wing parasites that I think I've run out of time for. But we do need to at least look at Siphonaptera, that's the fleas, and not that closely related, the Diptera, that's the flies, because both of those include a number of true parasites, a number of which are of medical and veterinary importance. And we'll start with Siphonaptera, fleas. These are, of course, wingless, blood-sucking insects, which I assume everybody has seen at some point. There are about 2,500 known species, 3/4 of which parasitize mammals. The group that gets them the most is rodents, although, of course, there are dog fleas, cat fleas, human fleas, and there's an entire family of fleas that is restricted to armadillos. There's about 6% that will parasitize birds. Reptile fleas are also known. They vary in just how host specific they are. Fleas that are parasites on larger mammals tend to be more host specific, whereas fleas that are parasitic on smaller mammals are not quite so dependent on one species. And in fact, a lot of those are just nest parasites, in that they'll live primarily in the nest of a rodent or a rabbit or something like that, and they'll bite when they need to feed, but they don't spend all of their time crawling around on the skin. Whereas dog fleas spend a much greater proportion of their life cycle actually on a dog. They're wingless, but they're noted for their great jumping abilities. Cat fleas can, from a standing start, jump 33 centimeters high. Since each cat flea is maybe a millimeter in size, this works out to about 200 times body length. And the way they're able to do it is an awesome case of what evolutionary biologists call exaptation, the ability to reuse structures that evolved in one context to do something different. And in this case, what they're reusing is a protein called resolin. Resolin is extremely elastic. It is more elastic than rubber. Typical rubber, if you compress rubber and it springs back, you get about 85% of the energy back. In resolin, it's over 90%. And in many winged insects, resolin stores energy that allows the wings to beat more rapidly than the muscles can contract. When a fly is beating its wings, the individual muscles can't contract more often than, I forget the actual number, but it's something on the order of 40 times a second. But the wings can beat much faster than that. They can beat many thousands of times a second. And that's because they're able to store contractile energy and release it, and then recapture it and release it very quickly, because the wing hinge contains big pads of resolin. So that when, I don't have a good diagram for this, at least not in here. I talk about this in invertebrate zoology. The muscle only has to contract once, and the wings go, in effect, boing, 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 and they'll flap up and down repeatedly after only one muscle contraction. So flies, for example, can have their wings beating many thousands of times a second without the muscles having to beat many thousands of times a second, because muscles can't contract that fast. Fleas evolved from winged ancestors. Last I looked, their closest relatives are a group called the Mycoptera, otherwise known as scorpion flies. And fleas maintain pads of resolin. They don't have wings, of course, but they've got these resolin pads up close to the leg joints. And what they're able to do when they bend their legs is compress those resolin pads and lock them in place, kind of like pushing a spring, compressing a spring and then locking it in place with a little catch. So what a flea will do is bend its wings and essentially, cock itself. And then when it leaps, it releases that spring, and the stored energy is released all of a sudden, and the flea springs into the air. It's a really neat little arrangement for being able to jump much higher and generate force much faster than the flea's muscles could actually do. Those are stages in the life cycle of, this happens to be a dog flea. Second from the top is actually an egg, and that falls off the dog and hatches into a little worm, maybe a couple of millimeters long. The worm is not particularly parasitic. The worms will feed on detritus. They'll feed on dead skin that's also fallen off the dog. They might eat eggs that don't hatch. They'll eat pretty much whatever they can. And then they pupate. Third from the top is a flea puparium. They'll emerge as adults and then jump onto a dog, or for that matter, a human. I don't think this is a very host-specific species. And take blood meals and prepare to reproduce. So the life cycle is, the word we use is holometabolous, meaning that the larva doesn't look anything like an adult. If it were hemimetabolous, the egg would hatch into something that looked a lot like a miniature adult. But holometaboly is what flies and also butterflies, for instance, go through. The egg hatches into a larva that is, grub-like and very different from the adult anatomy. Adult fleas have, 3 sets of mouth parts. They've got antennae, but the antennae are extremely reduced because you don't want big antennae flapping around when you're crawling in between dog hairs or rat hairs or whatever the case might be. There's an extension of the mouth called the epipharynx, which has a very long groove in it. It's not a perfect tube. It's still open, but it's almost tube-like. And that's surrounded by a pair of saw-toothed appendages that are branches of one set of mouth parts, the maxillae. These branches of the maxillae are called the laciniae. They've got little saw teeth on them, and they help cut into the host's skin. The laciniae form a tube that saliva passes through, and then the epipharynx in the middle of the tube contains the channel that blood actually passes up into. So they've actually got separate channels for injecting saliva and sucking up blood. Aside from the, blood sucking, which is bad enough, fleas are also notorious for transmitting bacterial disease. Here you've got a medieval illustration of the Black Death, this plague that wiped out roughly a third of the population of Europe in the middle of the 1300s. These two plague victims, those swellings are infected lymph nodes, which have swollen up into these blackened swellings on the body called buboes, hence the name bubonic plague. If the same bacterium is transmitted by aerosols into the lungs, it causes pneumonic plague. So two different horrible diseases for one bacterium. Great deal. Can't get that these days. And it was spread by this thing, an Asian rat flea called Xenopsilla chiopus, which normally lives on rats, which can carry Black Plague but are fairly immune to it. They don't get very sick. But it's quite willing to bite humans if the opportunity presents itself. And it was these rat fleas arriving on rats, which were carried around by global shipping, that ultimately spread the Black Plague. Oh, there's an oft-repeated legend that the Black Plague happened because some pope had declared that cats were instruments of the devil and were supposed to be wiped out. And so for 200 years, medieval people killed every cat that they could and then were left defenseless against the plague. You'll hear that legend going around, and it's almost certainly untrue. Medieval people weren't that stupid. Medieval people recognized that cats were important for keeping down rat populations that, completely aside from the plague, would eat all your grain. So those, the cat burnings that you might have heard of, as far as I'm aware, didn't actually happen. There. You may be happy to know this, you goofy cat. Yes, goofy cat. Most fleas are ectoparasites, but there's one that's an endoparasite that I thought was really cool and really horrifying. Tunga penetrans is the smallest of the fleas. It's only 1 millimeter long. They're called sand fleas because the larvae will mature in sand. And from there, the adults will jump onto animal or human skin. They'll feed on human blood. And once they're mature, the females will start burrowing into the outer layer of human skin, the stratum corneum, which is that outermost layer of dead cells. They'll burrow completely into the human skin. Takes them about a day to do. Once they're finished, the only parts that are sticking out are the anus, the genitalia, and 4 little air holes on the butt. This is quite enough for the males to mate with them. Males mate with the female. Should be mate, not maid. Okay, the males mate it with the females, and the males then die. At least one of you turkeys did a poster on chigoe, or jigger fleas, as they're called. Once the females have mated, they swell up into these round ball-shaped bodies, like a big blob with a tiny little head at one end and a tiny little butt on the other. The balls can reach up to 1 centimeter in diameter, and they start laying eggs. And this is what one of them looks like on human skin. That dark spot in the middle is the butt end of the flea, and you can see the eggs that are being laid all around. And we have somebody joining us. All right, Sherpa, good to hear from you. Morning, Sherpa. We're talking about Caribbean sand fleas. Morning. Yep. Okay, so getting back to our Caribbean sand fleas. Just to go back one for a second, this is what they look like as adults. They'll feed on human blood. Females then burrow into human skin. Males mate with the females while they're burrowed into the skin with only their genitalia sticking out. And the females swell up into these ball-shaped bodies and start laying several hundred eggs. There you've got a swelling in somebody's toe. There's a female in there. That kind of wiry brown thing that you see sticking off to the left is a fecal string. So that's the butt end of the female where she's taking the poo. And once all of the eggs are laid, the females die. The body tries to break them down. There'll be an immune response, and the outer layer of skin is constantly sloughing off. So eventually the body will be able to heal itself, except for the fact that the resulting lesion is prone to secondary infection. While you've got this ulcer with a rotting flea inside your skin, that can be a place for bacteria to colonize. You can end up with abscesses that way. And if you've got lots of these in your feet, this can be crippling. I actually, a couple of years ago, talked with a guy who was going on a mission trip somewhere in the Caribbean. And he was the one who actually told me about this for the first time. I'd never heard of it before. And he was trying to come up with ways he could help people. And I gave him a suggestion, which I actually found out was actually a good one. One of the ways you can treat this, or at least break the life cycle, is if you have one of these swellings, you cover it with a very thick layer of Vaseline. And the idea is that you'll kill the flea if you plug up the breathing tubes of the flea. Now, unfortunately, you're still left with a goddamn dead flea in your skin, so it doesn't fix everything. But if it can kill them before they start laying eggs, you can at least interrupt the life cycle and get the population down. So yeah, if you are ever attacked by sand fleas, that might actually work. Hope nobody ever has to deal with this, but if you are, now you know. Never let it be said I don't teach useful stuff. Right, that's all the flea stuff we've got time for. Now let's turn to the flies in order Diptera, two-wing. The ancestral state for winged insects is two pairs of wings. Flies have one pair of wings, and the second pair is shrunk down and modified into a pair of little balance and airspeed detection organs called halteres. Lots of flies are, of course, micropredators, and some of them we've talked about because they're vectors for other parasites. So phlebotomine flies include the sand flies, some of which transmit leishmania. They can also transmit various bacterial diseases. Culicidae is the family that includes mosquitoes, which of course transmit malaria. They also can transmit viruses like Zika. They can also transmit filarial nematodes. Simulidae are the black flies, which I'm not sure actually transmit anything, but they can be so incredibly numerous that they've killed animals before. And they can cause systemic, body-wide reactions in people that get heavily bitten. I did field work as a young grad student in North Russia, about spitting distance south of the Arctic Circle on a place called the White Sea. And there were some beautiful, clear, swiftly running streams near where we camped. Guess where black flies like to live? The larvae are aquatic, and they like living in clear, swiftly running streams. As long as there was wind, it wasn't too much of a problem. But we were low on repellent, and I got bit like you wouldn't believe, and I swear my face looked like a damn basketball. And it was getting to the point where I was feeling, overall physically ill. You can get this syndrome if you get bitten by too many black flies. Something to be careful about when Dr. Cash asks you about doing field work up in the Canadian Arctic. So black flies are pretty bad. Ceratopagonids, you probably know, those are no-see-ums, the biting midges. Tabanidae includes horseflies and deer flies, and those can also transmit some species of trypanosoma and some nematodes. Glossina is the genus of tsetse flies that transmits African sleeping sickness. And Muscadie includes the house flies, which also include livestock pests like stable flies and horn flies, which, again, each individual fly doesn't do all that much, but if you're being bitten by thousands of them at once, it can actually really compromise the health of a horse or a cow if you're in an area where these things are extremely common. So vet people, you might encounter these sometime down the road if you get into large animal practice. Horn flies are one of the reasons why you see cows with insecticide impregnated ear tags. But there's also flies that are more persistent parasites. And this is one of them. This is Melophagus ovinus. It's a member of the fly family Hippoboscidae, and they're called louse flies because they are completely wingless. At least the females are. Males are usually winged. Sometimes, in some species, the males are wingless as well. These are blood feeders. And instead of flitting around from host to bite and drink blood like a mosquito, Hippoboscids stay on one host for much longer. In fact, females may spend all of their lives on a single host. This species is an economically important sheep pest. The common name for them is keds, sheep keds. And they tend to feed on, they'll feed on dead tissue, but they'll also bite. They'll drink blood. Heavy infestations make the sheep anemic. They cause overall weakness. They cause scarring on the skin. They can degrade the quality of the wool and bite the hell out of anybody that's trying to shear the damn sheep. So yeah, these guys are not much in favor among shepherds and sheep farmers. And then this is really weird because Casey Larson's husband, Dr. Gettinger, works on these guys. He was the one who taught parasitology here before I kind of took it over. And he actually brought in some specimens one day. So I've actually seen some of these. They're called nycterabiids. There is technically a head there, but the eyes are completely gone. The head is kind of folded back into a groove on the thorax. It's that little lump kind of in the middle of the thorax in between the first two pairs of legs. When I first saw these, I thought they were spiders because what you're seeing is the thorax, the abdomen, and then this little lump, which since it hasn't got eyes, it's not immediately obvious that it's a head. And then I noticed that it had the wrong number of legs to be a spider, but I was kind of stumped by it for a while. Nycterabiids are bat parasites. They're wingless and eyeless, and nobody seems to know an awful lot about them, except for Don Gettinger, Casey Larson's husband. If you're really curious, you could probably ask him. He used to go down to Brazil on a regular basis and study, among other things, Brazilian nycterabiids. And again, not very well understood. are nycterobeids. Sorry about that. The slides from here on out are going to include some that are a little bit gross. There are flies also that are endoparasites because they'll actually burrow into tissues instead of, like the sheep keds just hanging out on the outside permanently. Infection of tissues with fly larvae is called myiasis. You can get infected occasionally by fly species that are not normally parasitic, like houseflies. There have been cases of people getting housefly maggots, typically if they've got, infected wounds or something like that. But houseflies don't normally eat human flesh, and so we'd call this pseudomyiasis. And then there's a number of species that may or may not be parasitic. They can choose, and we call that facultative myiasis. Hello, cat. And yes, Fern has just photobombed the hello. Cat, you have been fed. You have eaten.
I love Fern. I'm so glad she's here.
Yeah, she's a sweet kitty. Fern, please get out of the way. I can't see what I'm doing. We used to call Fern Helpful Kitty because no matter what we wanted to do, she had to be in the middle of it. Usually my wife's craft projects that she would leap right into the middle of. She was so helpful.
Good kitty.
All right. So here's one example that has some parasites and facultative parasites. Caliphoridae is the blowflies. Many of these have a metallic sheen to them, and they're commonly called blue bottle flies or green bottle flies. Most blowflies feed on carrion. They're the kind of things that if you've watched, like CSI or some shows like that, you might know there's a field called forensic entomology, where if you find, let's say, a body that's been dumped, you can try to calculate things like time of death by looking at what species of flesh-eating insect have colonized the corpse. And blowflies in the genus Lucilia are typically some of the first. Critters like that will eat primarily dead meat, but there's some that will lay their eggs in wounds. The previous slide that had those maggots around someone's eye, that was actually a green bottle fly in this family, the Caliphoridae. And one that's particularly bad for sheep, especially in Australia, but I think it's pretty worldwide now, is Lucilia cuprina, which causes a condition called wool strike. Strike, by the way, is an old word for attack of a parasitic fly. And Lucilia cuprina will lay eggs on skin folds of sheep, especially skin folds that are stained with feces and urine. So they'll lay it around the butt of the sheep. If the sheep has very thick wool, it may be impossible to keep the back end of the sheep from getting, stained and matted with feces. They'll lay them around the tip of the penis of male sheep because the wool there tends to get stained and matted with urine. And the larvae will eat the feces, they'll eat the flesh, and they'll create these big wounds. These are some maggots in a wound. That's actually a sheep foot. They'll eventually drop off and pupate in the soil. And they can cause very severe wounds. The sheep can be weakened rather badly. The total quality of the wool can fall off. Sheep tend to make less luxurious wool if they're unhealthy and stressed. They can cause severe damage to the skin. The maggots can. They can damage the wool themselves, and the wounds can become secondarily infected. So this is something you really do not want to see if you are a sheep farmer. In Australia, if they want you to get a move on, instead of saying move it, they'll say rattle your dags. Dags are mats of hair mixed with feces that tend to grow up around a sheep's anus. And if a sheep has to run fast, it may be said to be rattling its dags. And one of the ways to try to avoid Lucilia wool strike is by trimming the dags off, trying to keep the butt end of your sheep as clean as possible. Not that that's always very possible, but you do what you can. So, yeah, now you know what dags are. Oh, on a less disgusting note, I did read that they've experimented with vaccines, and they don't stop parasitism, but they do slow down the growth of blowfly maggots if the sheep already have antibodies against them. So there's a bunch of things that sheep herders can do to try to cut down the incidence of wool strike. Oddly enough, it's closely related to greenbottle flies, Lucilia sericata, and this is a species that's actually been used clinically to treat wounds that aren't healing very well. This was actually discovered by an army doctor in the First World War who had to treat some soldiers that had been severely wounded and had lain out on the battlefield for several days before they could finally be brought in. And he found, much to his horror, that their wounds had been colonized by thousands of greenbottle fly maggots. And he hastily removed all of them and then discovered that underneath, the wound was actually healing very nicely, very nice pink granulation tissue. The maggots had eaten all of the dead tissue and left the living tissue alone. It's later been found that blowfly maggots actually produce secretions that can inhibit bacterial growth. And I don't know how commonly it's in use now, but there are people today who've received maggot therapy, especially for wounds that don't heal well on themselves, like diabetic foot ulcers and things like that. So green bottles are not normally parasitic as such, and they can actually be used beneficially, which I suppose is good to know. Screwworm is one that can parasitize both humans and livestock. There are both old world, African and Asian screwworm species, and Cochleomya hominivorax is the New World species. They can't penetrate healthy skin, but they'll lay eggs on human and animal worms. The larvae can burrow pretty deeply, feeding on living tissue. Can certainly cause human disease, but it was a major problem for livestock. The U.S. managed to eradicate it in 1982 by breeding large numbers of sterile males. I think the males actually were made sterile by radiation treatments, I think. I think they zapped them with x-rays or some such. This works because a female screwworm fly will only mate once in her life. So if you make sure that all of the available males are sterile, the screwworm fly will not be able to, will still mate and lay eggs, but none of the eggs will hatch into larvae. And again, you found a good way to break the life cycle. It's still around in Central America. I think the closest it gets to us is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. But yeah, this has been a pretty good success story, getting rid of screwworm fly in the United States. Botflies are in the family Estridae, And this includes the human botfly, Dermatobia hominis. Like the screwworm fly, human botflies can't penetrate the skin. So females will lay eggs on blood-sucking insects like mosquitoes. They've also been known to lay their own eggs on ticks. And I gave this as an example, I think, way back at the beginning of a relationship called phoresy. If you remember Phoresy, phoresy is when one species uses another to hitch a lift, but otherwise doesn't damage it or anything like that. You know, like remoras on sharks. Human botflies will lay clusters of eggs on mosquitoes or other biting flies. And as soon as your mosquito takes a bite of a human, the eggs immediately hatch into larvae. The larvae promptly drop onto the skin and penetrate into the bite wound. And there they will feed, and there they will develop. You've got the first 3 larval instars. That third instar larva is very recognizable because it's got those things that look like cauliflower growing out of its head. And eventually these will pupate and develop into adults. This is what they look like when removed from the skin. And those dark things are spines that make it impossible to just squeeze one of these out. You can't pop a dermatobia blister the way you could a pimple. If there's a lot of them, surgery may be required to remove them. If there's a lot of them, or if they're in an unsightly place. Hello, Fern. Here we go again. Kitty cat. There's some particularly nasty ones that deposit larvae in nostrils. Estrus ovis right there deposits larvae in sheep and goat nostrils. And the larvae will crawl up into the sinuses and feed up there until spring. And again, they don't seem to cause a huge amount of harm except for just general misery. Evidence suggests that infected sheep are not very comfortable. They'll feed up in there until spring and then crawl out or get sneezed out and pupate in the soil, and round goes the circle of life. There is incidentally another species in this genus that does the same trick with reindeer. So the suggestion is that Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer might have actually had a very severe estrus infestation. And then probably the worst are warble flies, genus Hypoderma. There's a couple of species that parasitize cows. There's other species that also parasitize deer, moose, reindeer. A number of hoofed mammals get parasitized by Hypoderma. The adults lay their eggs typically on the hairs of cow legs. Exactly where depends on what species you're talking about. And this is weird. It's not at all painful to get eggs laid on you if you're a cow, but something about the vibrations that Hypoderma makes, something about its sound, makes cows extremely nervous. And the cows will start running, they'll start galloping. Sorry, cat, move the slide back. The cat is now licking herself in a way I'm glad you can't see. Cat. Right. And the cows will gallop around to try to get away from the warble flies. They instinctively react very negatively to warble fly sounds. Incidentally, this behavior of frenzied running to try to get away from warble flies, the old word for that is gadding. And a fly that causes cows to go around gadding is a gadfly. These days, we mostly use that word metaphorically. You know, a gadfly is somebody who, you know, causes a strong reaction. You know, sorry, a political commentator might be a gadfly if he's constantly trying to provoke. There, good kitty. But yeah, the original meaning was one of these warble flies. Incidentally, warble flies used to be placed in the same genus, Estrus. And yeah, that used to be the genus that warble flies were in. And from that word, estrus is used to mean, heat, the season in which mammals are ovulating, because they can also be acting pretty strangely at that time as well, where animals might be completely indifferent to sex for 11 months out of the year, and then for 1 month out of the year they get pretty wild, and we call that going into estrus. Well, that's the same word as the word that was applies to warble flies, because both of those make cows act funny. Anyway, eggs are laid on the hairs of the cow legs, and the larvae burrow into the hair follicles, burrow under the skin. Exactly where they go next depends on what species you've got, but they'll head forward up to the diaphragm. At least one species will actually burrow all the way to the connective tissue of the esophagus. And then they'll go back and they'll burrow along the back, and at least one species will burrow literally along the spine, get in there among the meninges, go up the spinal canal. This takes roughly a year, by the way. So these warble flies will, burrow from one end of the cow to the other, and then come back along the backside and form lumps under the skin called warbles. So there you've got, looks like about 6 warbles on the backside of a cow. They'll pierce the skin there so that they can breathe, and they'll stick their little spiracles out. They'll molt 3 times. When they're mature, they'll emerge out of these warbles, fall to the ground, and pupate in the soil, and then emerge as adults, and round goes the great circle of life. This can have pretty nasty effects on the cows. It's also not really good for the farmer because, heavily infected cows can be really sick, because you got damn fly larvae crawling through your organs, like ew. They can cause, in some cases, damage to the meat, and they definitely cause damage to the skin. If you've got a whole bunch of, warbles under the skin, they tend to leave holes in it, meaning that the skin becomes a lot less useful for leather or rawhide or whatever it is that you're using. So this is the kind of thing that requires very definite treatment if you are, trying to raise cattle in an area where warble flies are known to be present. I'm not sure what the incidence of these is in the U.S. I've read that in Britain, they have been almost completely eradicated. I'm not sure what the status is in the U.S. I'm not a large animal veterinarian. Oh, sorry. Should have warned you. This is the last one. Horse bots, species and genus Gastrophilus, lay their eggs on horse hairs. Some of them will lay eggs on hairs close to a horse's mouth. Others might lay them on the foreleg or something like that, a place that the horse can easily lick. And so the larvae either crawl into the mouth or the horse licks them up. They'll develop within mouth tissues and then crawl down into the stomach and will survive there for quite some time. I think the better part of the year. Ultimately, when they're fully developed, they'll detach from the stomach wall and pass out in the feces. And they'll pupate in the soil and then hatch as adults. Mild infections may be asymptomatic. Heavy infections can do some pretty serious damage to the horse's stomach. And yeah, this is the inside of a horse's stomach with a pretty heavy infestation of Gasterophilus horse bots. And on that note of horrible things living in a horse stomach, that would be that. Right. Any, see, what do we got on the chat? Yeah, sorry, Abby. Yeah, Abby says, I thought it would be a good idea to eat my oatmeal while watching this lecture. My apologies. Yeah, life ain't always pretty.
So, what do we know about our final?
Okay. What we know about our final is I promise I'm going to try to finish it this evening and distribute it to you in the usual way. And I'll give you as much time on this as possible. I think was it Monday was supposed to be our exam day?
I think so. I can check.
Okay, I can easily give you most of exam week. But yeah, it'll be a take-home thing with maybe a couple of short essays, and I promise I won't go out of my way to make it. I will try to make it challenging without being evil. Let's put it that way.
Our final is on Wednesday at sometime on Wednesday.
All right. Oh, okay. So it would have been in 1 week. I can probably give you a couple more days than that.
Okay.
Okay, and I promise I'll actually finish it this afternoon. I've gotten steamrollered by 1400, but I'll try to peel myself up off the asphalt.
Appreciate it.
All right, I'm going to go stop recording, and there we go.